Today we're making the puff sleeve dress. This dress is so cute with 2 different sleeves and 2 different lengths. I've got all my fabric cut, the elastic and the zipper. And one thing to note is that for the lining fabric, I just used the same as the main because I had enough left over. We're going to start with the sleeve, and right now the instructions are the same for both sleeve A and sleeve B. You're going to start by drawing a line 1/2 inch down from the top on the right side of the sleeve. I use a fabric marker to do this, one that will disappear after it gets wet. Next up is finishing the top edge of the sleeve. You can use a serger or a zigzag stitch to do this. If you're using a serger like me, don't take any off on the edge, just sew close to the edge. Using the drawn line as your guide, fold the sleeve back towards the wrong side and press in place. Now sew the folded edge in place, sewing it close to the open edge. Follow these instructions to continue on with sleeve A. If you're doing sleeve B, skip ahead to that section. Fold your sleeve in half so that right sides are touching. Then sew the short sides together and finish the seam when you're done. With the sleeve still inside out, turn up the bottom edge, first 1/4 inch and then 3/8 inches, and press in place. Then sew very close to the open edge, but leave a 1 inch gap so that you can insert the elastic. Cut the elastic according to the size chart and then thread it onto a safety pin or a bodkin. Then you're going to thread that bodkin through the gap opening all the way around the sleeve cuff. Keep the tail of the elastic out because when you get to the other side, you're going to sew the 2 tails of elastic together. Secure the 2 tails firmly in place and then tuck them back into the gap opening and sew a line closing the gap. And as you're closing that gap, try really hard not to catch any elastic into it. Now cut the elastic for the shoulder part and then thread it onto a bodkin or safety pin and thread that through the top casing opening of the shoulder. When the tail of the elastic meets the opening, stop threading and go ahead and secure that elastic tail in place, going over it several times just to make sure that it's firmly secured. Then continue pulling the safety pin out to the other side, and when you've got it all the way through the casing, stop and secure the elastic in place there as well. Again, going over it several times just to make sure. Okay, your sleeve is all done for now. You're going to turn it right side out and then repeat these steps for the other sleeve before you move on to the next step. These are the instructions for the B sleeve. If you've already done the A sleeve, you can skip ahead to the bodice section. You'll need a ruler or straight edge and then a fabric marker, and using your notches as guides, draw 2 lines all the way across your sleeve on the wrong side. Create a hem by turning up the bottom edge 1/8 inch and then 1/8 inch again, press it in place, and then sew a straight line across. Take your casing piece and turn it so that wrong side is facing you. Fold in the 2 long edges so that they touch each other in the middle. Then press it in place. Okay, make sure that the wrong side of the sleeve is facing you and you can see your 2 drawn lines. Lay your casing piece out on the top line and open up the bottom flap so that it just lays against this line. Then you're going to sew it in place all the way down the sleeve using a straight stitch. After you're done, fold it down and in place, tucking in that flap as you go. That flap is going to line up with your bottom drawn line, and now sew a stitch closing up that edge. Try to stay as close to the edge as you can when you're sewing. Cut a piece of elastic according to the chart and thread it onto a bodkin or a safety pin. Thread that through your casing, and when the tail of the elastic just meets the casing opening, Stop what you're doing and sew it in place, securing it several times with multiple stitches. Then continue pushing the safety pin through to the other side, and when it comes out the other side, secure it in place there as well. Now cut a piece of elastic for the shoulder and thread it onto a bodkin or safety pin. Begin threading it through that shoulder opening. When the tail of the elastic meets the open edge, stop what you're doing and sew it in place, securing it several times. Then continue pushing the bodkin through to the other side, and when the elastic comes through, then secure it in place there as well. Okay, adjust your gathers and then fold your sleeve in half so that right sides are touching, and sew that short side together that's right underneath the arm opening. Finish your seam and then turn your sleeve right side out and follow these same instructions to create the other sleeve before moving on to the bodice. Take your bodice pieces that you cut from your main fabric, lay out the front bodice piece and then one of the back bodice pieces so that right sides are touching, and sew your short side there in place using a 1/2 inch seam. Open it up and then repeat the same thing for the other side, right sides together and sewing that short side together. Now repeat these steps for your lining fabric. After creating both your main bodice and your lining bodice, open them both up and press the seams open in place. Now it's time to sew the sleeves on to the main bodice. Set the lining bodice aside for now. And it doesn't matter which sleeve you did, the instructions are the same for both. Notice that there is a curved opening on the bodice that exactly matches the curve, the raw edge curve of your sleeve. With the right side of your bodice facing up and the right side of the sleeve facing you, you're going to pin the sleeve around that curved opening. Start first by matching up the seam of the sleeve and matching it to the seam on the bodice. Then stretch up the sides all the way to the top of that curve and pin those in place as well. This part is a little bit tricky because the elastic does want to pull and make it hard to pin in place. And if you find that your sleeve does not quite meet that top of that opening, go ahead and pull the elastic over so that it does meet the top. Otherwise, this is what your finished piece will look like. Whereas if you can get that elastic to meet the top edge, then it will look like this and you won't have that gap there. When your sleeve is pinned in place, it will look like this. Notice that the seam of the bodice matches up with the seam of the sleeve, and all the curves match up together. Use a basting stitch to secure the sleeve in place. Then repeat those steps for the other sleeve so that both sleeves are now attached. With right sides together, you're going to lay the lining bodice on top of the main bodice and begin pinning them together starting at that top corner. The next corner is going to have the sleeve sandwiched in between, right there where the elastic is. But then you're going to need to push the sleeve elastic down and not catch it in your seam. You don't want any more of that elastic in there after you've grabbed the corner. You just want the curve of the lining and the main bodice there around the arm opening, pinning them in place with no elastic. Keep going around that curve until you get to the top corner again where the sleeve is sewn in place. And at that point, it's okay to have the sleeve sandwiched in between. This is a little tricky because the elastic does pull and it makes the bodice piece seem a little bit funny. But as long as you get that elastic pushed down, you should be okay. And it is time to sew it in place. As you're sewing, go slow so that you can go carefully around the corners and curves and feel that the elastic is not getting caught in the seam. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this so that the basting stitch is completely covered. When you're done sewing, Trim and clip all the corners so that it will lay nicely when it's flat. Turn your piece right side out and begin pressing everything in place. Set the bodice aside because it's time to work on the skirt. And it doesn't matter which length you're using, both instructions are the same. Lay the front skirt panel right side up and then lay one of the back panels on top of it, right sides together. Sew down that long side and then finish the seam and repeat for the other back skirt panel. When you're done, you'll have one long piece. Sew a gathering stitch along the top long edge. Pull the threads to begin gathering that edge until it is about half of the width that it was originally. This should make it so that the width of the skirt just about lines up with the width of the bodice. Now it's time to pin the bodice to the skirt right sides together. First, start by finding that seam, one of the side seams on the skirt, and match it up to the arm seam on the bodice. Pin it in place there and then continue to pin the skirt to the bodice. You might need to adjust the gathers a little bit to make sure that everything lines up. Slide the gathers around if you need to make sure everything is a good fit, and make sure that the other seams match up as well. When it's pinned together, use a basting stitch to join those two pieces. Then use a finishing stitch to complete the look. Now we're going to top stitch that seam, but first start by pressing it up so that it lays flat against the bodice. To top stitch, turn your piece so that right side is facing you and stitch really close to that edge. It will secure the seam in place and it will also give it a good polished look. Now let's address the two long raw edges on the back. Finish these edges by either using a serger or a zigzag stitch, going all the way from top to bottom. Then take your zipper and measure from the very top edge of the zipper pull all the way down to where the teeth end. This is how long we need to make the opening in the back. With right sides together, starting at the top of your dress, measure down and place a mark or a pin where the measurement needs to stop for the zipper. Then begin pinning those two sides together all the way down the rest of the dress. Using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, begin sewing down, starting where you made your mark all the way down to the bottom of the dress. Press open this seam so that it looks like this. Even past the split opening, continue to press down a 1/2 inch on either side. Using a straight stitch, begin sewing down that finished edge, starting at the very top and going all the way down to the bottom, so that your seam where it's pressed open is sewn down on both sides. You need to finish the zipper so that the tabs don't get in the way of the finished product. Begin by folding them down and sewing them in place. And it's easiest to sew them in place when the zipper pull is pushed down out of the way. To sew the zipper in the dress, you'll need to use a zipper foot. Most machines come with one, but if you don't have one for your machine, you can easily find one on Amazon that should match. Turn your dress so that the right side is facing you and pin the zipper in place on the wrong side. Starting at the top of your bodice, begin to sew down the edge of the zipper. Sew all the way down the zipper until you get to that bottom of that opening, and then you're going to sew across the opening and up the other side. But you can stop and adjust your pins, and also you'll probably need to move the zipper pull out of the way as you sew. You're basically sewing in a rectangle without sewing across the top edge of the rectangle. Okay, all we have left is the hem. Turn up the bottom edge, first 1/4 inch and then 3/8 inches, press it in place, and then sew a straight stitch all the way around that open edge until your hem is complete. Congrats, you just made the puff sleeve dress. Make sure you show us your creations on Instagram and be sure and check out our other patterns from Parade Patterns.